The morning sky over London was calm, soft gray clouds floating above the city's rooftops. The American embassy stood proud and quiet behind its tall iron gates, its flags fluttering gently in the cool breeze. It was a peaceful start to what everyone thought would be another normal diplomatic day. Inside the embassy courtyard, a few guards chatted over coffee. Security cameras rotated slowly, and uniformed staff prepared for visiting officials. Nothing seemed out of place. Special Agent Mark Drew arrived early, walking with his usual alert posture. He was a tall man in his 40s, calm but observant, a man who had seen too many unexpected turns in life to ever lower his guard. He had been in London for only a week, part of a joint intelligence exchange between the FBI and MI5. His job was to help improve security coordination between American and British agencies after several recent threats. He took that duty seriously. That morning, he was scheduled to meet an MI5 officer for a briefing. As he walked through the embassy's outer yard, he glanced at the royal guards posted across the street near the palace route. Their bright red coats, tall black hats, and perfectly still stance always amazed him. They stood like statues, yet Drew knew they were trained soldiers, quick and disciplined. Even though their uniforms looked ceremonial, they carried real weapons and real authority. He stopped for a moment near the embassy gate to check his messages. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he noticed a young man running toward the embassy entrance. The man carried a black case close to his chest, gripping it tightly. Drew frowned. It wasn't unusual for couriers or staff to carry briefcases, but this man wasn't wearing any identification badge. He wasn't in embassy uniform either. He looked nervous, almost panicked, glancing over his shoulder as if someone was chasing him. Drew's instincts flared. His training from years of FBI service whispered danger. He took a quick breath and called out, "Hey, stop! Identify yourself." The man didn't slow down. He kept running, his shoes slapping hard against the pavement. At that exact moment, one of the nearby royal guards shifted his stance. The guard had seen Drew's sudden movement, the raised voice, and the reaching hand. To him, it looked like a stranger. An armed foreign officer was shouting near a royal zone and making sudden moves toward his weapon. The guard's rules were strict. No armed motion near the palace boundaries, especially not from a non-British officer. The guard raised his rifle slightly, his eyes narrowing through the tall fur hat's shadow. Drew saw the movement and froze. He lifted a hand, palm open, trying to signal calm, but his focus was still split between the running man and the guard who now had his weapon angled toward him. For a second, both men just stared at each other. The embassy courtyard became silent except for the distant rumble of London traffic. A group of tourists standing by the corner noticed what was happening and began recording with their phones. Even a few children stopped eating their ice cream and looked curiously at the two men locked in tension. The suspicious man with the case suddenly turned into a side passage near the embassy, vanishing from view. Drew's heart raced. Every instinct screamed that something was wrong. He slowly reached for his side holster, not to fire but to be ready. The royal guard, seeing that motion, instantly stepped forward. His rifle came up sharply and his boots struck the pavement with precise sound. People gasped. Embassy staff at the security post jumped from their seats. Someone shouted, "Stand down! Stand down!" But the words were lost in the chaos. Drew's training told him to assess, not react, but the situation was spinning faster than reason. He drew his weapon but kept it pointed toward the ground away from the guard. "Stop, FBI! There's a suspect," he shouted, hoping the guard would understand. The guard didn't lower his rifle. His orders were to protect the royal perimeter at any cost. Any man pulling a gun near that zone was considered a potential threat, until proven otherwise. His finger tightened near the trigger, but he did not fire. He simply held his ground, eyes sharp, unmoving. The air grew heavy as if the whole city was holding its breath. A police officer from the nearby street ran toward them, followed by a few British security personnel. Inside the embassy, American Marines had already noticed the disturbance through the cameras. They began moving to the gate, one of them radioing the control room. Drew could hear distant alarms start to ring. His mind raced. He realized he was caught in a terrible misunderstanding. To the guard, he looked like an armed threat. To Drew, the guard was blocking him from stopping a possible attack. Both men were trained to protect lives, yet both were seconds away from a deadly mistake. A gust of wind rattled the flagpole. The guard's eyes didn't blink. Drew kept his weapon low, his breathing slow but tense. I'm FBI, he said again, this time slower, calmer. We have a possible threat. He ran that way. He pointed toward the corner where the man had vanished. The guard didn't respond. His expression was stone, as if carved from discipline itself. Then came the sound of boots from behind the guard. Another royal guard had joined, positioning himself on the opposite side. Now 2 rifles were pointed toward Drew's direction. Drew's pulse thumped hard in his ears. He knew if anyone made a sudden move, it could end badly for everyone. Onlookers began backing away. Some embassy staff tried to move civilians inside. Cars slowed down along the road. A news crew across the street turned their camera toward the standoff. The air felt electric with fear and uncertainty. Inside the embassy's control room, an MI5 liaison officer spotted the scene on the monitor. She recognized Drew instantly. She had met him 2 days earlier during the joint meeting. "That's Agent Drew," she shouted. "He's one of ours. Don't let them fire." She grabbed her radio and called directly to Palace Security, explaining that the man holding the gun was a U.S. officer assisting with counter-threat coordination. But communication between agencies was slow, and outside the situation remained frozen in that terrible silence. Drew stood still, weapon still pointed down, eyes locked with the guard. Both men breathed carefully, every second stretching longer than the last. For Drew, time slowed. He thought of his family back home, of his oath to protect, not harm. He wasn't afraid of dying, but he feared the cost of one mistake that could ruin peace between 2 allied nations. For the guard, the thought was the same in a different way. His honor was tied to his obedience. He couldn't break protocol, even if his instincts told him something felt off. A police siren echoed closer. Drew hoped someone would step in and clear things before it was too late. Then over his earpiece, the embassy's radio buzzed. "Stand by, Agent Drew. We're confirming your identity with local command." "Do not move," he exhaled slowly. At least someone was trying to fix it. A moment later, one of the British officers who had arrived stepped between them. "Hold your fire," he shouted at the guard. "He's American security." The guard didn't move right away, but after a brief pause, he slightly lowered his rifle, though still alert. Drew slowly reholstered his weapon, careful not to make any sharp motion. But the tension didn't end. People were still shouting directions, alarms still blared, and no one knew where the man with the black case had gone. Drew pointed toward the alley again. "That's where he went. Check it fast." The officer nodded and sent 2 men to follow the trail. In that fragile peace, the guard and Drew exchanged a quick look, not of anger, but of shared relief and exhaustion. Both realized they had been seconds away from disaster. The next few minutes would change everything, but in that first part of the day before the real storm began, the world saw something raw and human. 2 men on opposite sides of duty, trapped by the weight of their training and the urgency of their fear. As the embassy's doors closed behind Drew and more sirens filled the air, he felt a chill crawl down his neck. This wasn't over. Something told him the misunderstanding was only the beginning. He could sense that the true test, one that would shake both governments, was only moments away. The air around the embassy still felt tense after the standoff. People whispered, cameras flashed, and news alerts began to spread across London within minutes. Many believed something terrible had almost happened between an American agent and a royal guard. But inside the embassy, Agent Mark Drew didn't have time to think about what people were saying. His eyes were fixed on the screen in the security control room, showing live footage from the cameras outside. The man with the black case had vanished behind a stone wall near the side of the embassy. The last image showed him dropping the case near a fountain and running toward the main street. Drew's instincts told him it wasn't over. He leaned closer to the monitor, his pulse racing. "That's him," he said to the security team. "Zoom in on the bag." The guard on duty did as told, and the screen focused on the black case resting near the water. It looked ordinary, but its position was strange. It wasn't left beside a bench or a trash bin. It was right in the open, as if placed there deliberately. Drew's throat tightened. "That could be a device," he muttered. A British officer nearby nodded quickly and picked up the phone to call the bomb squad. Outside, the situation grew worse. Police vehicles had surrounded the area, their sirens echoing through the streets. British officers tried to keep the crowd back, while embassy staff hurried to escort civilians indoors. The Royal Guard stayed at their posts, expressionless but alert, rifles ready. Through the large windows, Drew could see flashing lights painting the embassy walls blue and red. He felt a deep weight in his chest. He knew how easily things could spiral in a moment like this. One wrong report, one quick assumption, and both nations could be in the headlines for all the wrong reasons. As the bomb squad was called, communication between the American security staff and British police became messy. Everyone was talking on radios, phones, and encrypted lines at once. Orders overlapped, voices shouted over one another, and the chain of command started to blur. Someone said the bag might belong to an embassy courier. Another officer claimed it could be part of a planned drill. Nobody knew for sure. Drew tried to bring order. "Let's clear the area around that fountain," he said firmly. "No one gets close until bomb disposal confirms." But before anyone could follow that order, a British constable shouted from the outer gate, "We have movement. 2 people running south." Drew turned toward the monitors again and saw 2 blurry shapes moving fast. His first thought was that one of them was the man who dropped the case. The other might be an accomplice. "They're not running like tourists," he said quickly. "Track them." The security team switched cameras, but visibility was poor. A light drizzle had started, and the street reflections made it difficult to see. Drew ran outside to the main yard, waving to the Marine guard at the gate. "Keep it locked," he ordered. "No one in or out until we confirm threat level." Outside, the cold air hit him like ice. He could hear radios crackling in different accents. British police, embassy security, and palace units all giving mixed commands. He moved carefully toward the outer fence and saw the same royal guard who had pointed a rifle at him earlier, still standing in position. Their eyes met for a moment. This time there was no hostility, just shared tension. "Did you see where he went?" Drew asked loudly. The guard didn't speak at first, then gave a short nod toward the side street. "Left, near the statue." "Thanks," Drew said, and ran back to the communication post. Minutes passed like hours. Every ticking second felt louder than the rain. The street outside had turned into a maze of flashing lights and armed officers. More vehicles arrived, some carrying the Royal Tactical Response Unit. They were heavily armed, dressed in black gear, their helmets reflecting the red light of the police cars. London hadn't seen such a fast military-style reaction near a royal zone in years. Inside the embassy, phones rang non-stop. American officials demanded answers, while British commanders requested confirmation of the armed man's identity. The press had already caught wind of a confrontation between U.S. and British forces. Drew could hear snippets of panic from aides trying to calm both sides. Meanwhile, the young man with the black case was still unaccounted for. The footage from nearby traffic cameras showed him slipping into a narrow alley. Drew studied the video frame by frame. The man wore a dark coat, his face half hidden by the hood. "Enhance that frame," Drew said. When the picture cleared slightly, he saw something unexpected. A badge clipped to the coat pocket. It looked like an embassy clearance card. Drew froze. "Wait, he's one of ours?" An MI5 officer leaned closer. "That's not possible. He's not on our clearance list." But Drew had seen enough of those badges to know the difference. "It's either fake or stolen," he said quietly. Either way, he knew where to run. Outside, British officers began widening the safety zone. Barricades were placed across the road. The press was pushed back. People inside nearby shops were told to stay indoors. From the embassy's roof, American snipers watched carefully, ready for orders that no one wanted to give. And then it happened. The black case by the fountain started to smoke. A thin white line of vapor rose slowly into the air. Someone shouted through the radio, "Possible activation!" "Step back," officers shouted, and people began to run. Drew felt his stomach twist. He grabbed the nearest microphone and yelled, "Evacuate that sector now." The next 10 seconds felt endless. The bomb squad truck screeched to a halt, and 2 technicians jumped out wearing heavy suits. They ran toward the fountain, staying low. Drew could hear his own breathing in his earpiece. The technician raised his hand, ready to check, and placed a small scanner near the case. The machine beeped once, twice, and then went silent. Everyone waited. Then over the radio, a voice came through. "No explosive reading yet. Stand by for visual." The crowd around the area had fallen completely silent. Even the police radios seemed to pause. Drew could see sweat rolling down his temple despite the cold air. He whispered to himself, "Please don't let this be what I think it is." The technician slowly lifted the case lid with a hook. Inside were papers, hundreds of loose documents, some stamped with the American embassy seal. The officer looked confused. "It's files," he said into the radio. "Just embassy paperwork." A wave of disbelief ran through everyone listening. Drew stepped back, rubbing his forehead. He dropped classified files and ran, he murmured. That's why he looked scared. The bomb squad chief gave the all-clear sign. But by that time, the damage was already done. The scene was swarming with armed units. News drones were flying overhead, and the image of Drew pulling his gun earlier had already reached the public. People didn't know it was a misunderstanding. They saw what they wanted to see. A standoff between two allied forces. As the sirens died down, the royal commander arrived on site. His uniform was spotless, his voice sharp. Who authorized an American agent to draw a weapon near a royal guard? He demanded. Drew stepped forward calmly. Sir, I saw a possible threat. I reacted to protect lives. The commander's eyes were cold. And in the process, you almost started an international disaster. Drew didn't argue. He just looked toward the place where the man had vanished. Somewhere out there, an intern or spy, or maybe just a terrified employee, was on the run with answers that could explain everything. Rain began to fall harder. The embassy's lights glowed through the mist as armed units continued their search. Drew stood in silence, thinking about how fast peace could turn into panic. All it had taken was a few seconds, a misunderstanding, and a black case. He had no idea that the next part of this story, the arrival of the armed palace units, would turn the situation from chaos to something even bigger than anyone could have expected. Rain kept falling softly over London, washing the tension into puddles that reflected flashing red and blue lights. The air was heavy with the sound of radios and quiet murmurs. Though the bomb squad had cleared the black case, no one felt safe yet. There was still a missing man, a trail of confusion, and two governments trying to control a story that had already spread faster than they could handle. Agent Mark Drew stood under the edge of the embassy gate, soaked but still focused. He was tired but alert, his mind replaying every second of what had just happened. He could not forget the royal guard's steady aim, the sound of shouting or the fear that had gripped the crowd. He felt like a man who had come within inches of destroying a friendship between nations. Inside the embassy, senior officers were arguing in tight circles. Some demanded Drew be suspended immediately to calm the political heat. Others defended him, saying he had followed his instincts when he believed lives were at risk. Drew didn't speak. He just stared at the live camera feed showing dozens of police cars still outside, their lights flashing across the wet pavement. Then an urgent voice came through the radio. Possible threat detected near the south gate. 2 unidentified vehicles moving without clearance. Drew snapped his head up. What kind of vehicles? He asked sharply. Black Range Rovers, no license plates visible, the voice replied. They're coming from the palace route. For a split second, Drew thought the missing man might be escaping in one of them. But when the gates opened and the cars stopped, his breath caught. Out stepped soldiers in dark uniforms, helmets gleaming under the rain. The emblem on their arms made everyone inside the embassy freeze. They were part of the Royal Tactical Response Team, an elite unit deployed only under palace command. The embassy courtyard filled with movement as armed officers took positions. British voices shouted orders. American Marines adjusted their stance, and Drew's radio buzzed non-stop. Palace units are here to take control, someone said. They want to secure the area completely. Drew stepped forward to meet them, holding his identification card high.
Special Agent Mark Drew, FBI liaison, he said clearly.
But the commander of the royal unit didn't look impressed. His face was stern, his tone clipped. You are the man who drew a weapon near one of our guards? Yes, sir, Drew answered firmly. There was confusion. I believe there was a threat. It's under investigation. The commander gave a short nod, then turned to his men. Secure the perimeter. No one leaves. No one enters. Not even embassy staff without verification. The rain grew heavier, hitting helmets and windows like soft static. Inside, embassy workers whispered nervously. Cameras from nearby news outlets were already rolling, trying to film through the fences. The situation looked worse than it was, an armed standoff between allies on foreign soil. Drew followed the royal commander toward the fountain where the black case had been found. The papers were now sealed in a plastic evidence bag. Drew spoke quietly. "Sir, the man who dropped this case is still missing. He had embassy-level clearance." "Then your own security has a leak," the commander said coldly, "and we are not leaving until we find out why." Drew didn't like his tone, but he understood it. The royal units were trained to handle crises involving national symbols, and the embassy was within their protective zone. Still, something about the commander's urgency felt deeper, almost as if they knew more than they were saying. He looked at one of the soldiers scanning the walls with a thermal device. "Are you expecting more than one suspect?" Drew asked. The soldier didn't answer, but his eyes shifted slightly toward the embassy roof. Drew followed his gaze. Two figures were already up there, snipers from the palace unit taking overwatch positions. Within minutes, the embassy grounds were surrounded. The hum of helicopters rolled overhead, and more police vans arrived to block nearby roads. London's heart had turned into a maze of flashing lights and silent guns. Drew couldn't believe how fast it had escalated. He had only drawn his weapon for a few seconds, but now the entire British defense grid was focused on this small block of the city. Inside the control room, MI5 officers were trying to calm both sides. A phone call from the U.S. State Department came through demanding an explanation. The British Foreign Office replied that the situation was under royal security review. Drew could feel the weight of politics pressing against every decision. Then a call came through the command channel. An MI5 analyst had traced the missing man's ID badge. "The clearance card was real," she said breathlessly, "but registered under a deceased courier from 2 years ago. That changed everything." Drew's eyes narrowed. "So someone used a dead man's clearance to get into the embassy?" "Yes, he might have been inside before you saw him run." Drew's mind spun with possibilities. Maybe the man wasn't a terrorist but a whistleblower, or maybe he was a spy trying to steal data. Either way, the situation was no longer just a misunderstanding. It was a serious breach. He turned to the royal commander. "We're dealing with infiltration," he said urgently. "Not an accident." The commander hesitated, then signaled his team. "Search the entire block. Every building, every corner." The soldiers spread out, moving with quiet precision. Their boots splashed through puddles as they checked parked cars and back alleys. Drew joined them, ignoring the rain soaking through his coat. His eyes scanned every shadow. Somewhere in that maze of lights and walls, a man held the answer to why all this had happened. Then a shout broke the silence. "Over here!" Everyone turned. One of the British officers had found something near the side gate. A coat, torn at the sleeve, lying beside a drainage vent. Inside the pocket was a small memory drive, half broken but still intact. Drew picked it up carefully. "Get this to analysis," he said. "Now." As he spoke, he noticed the royal guard from earlier watching him from a distance, the same man he had faced with a gun hours ago. Their eyes met again, this time with understanding instead of anger. The guard gave a small nod, acknowledging that Drew had acted with duty, not recklessness. Drew returned the nod silently. The radio buzzed again. "Confirmed, Palace Command is taking full control. All embassy weapons are to be declared and logged." The message made Drew tense. He didn't like surrendering control of American arms, but orders were orders. He walked back toward the main gate, his shoes echoing on the wet pavement. The air smelled of metal and rain. Behind him, soldiers continued their search, while embassy staff stood in groups whispering and glancing nervously at the armed men guarding every door. 3 minutes after the royal units had arrived, the embassy was completely surrounded. Streets were blocked, airspace restricted, and guards positioned on every corner. To the world outside, it looked like a siege. To those inside, it felt like the calm before another storm. Drew leaned against a stone pillar, exhausted but alert. He knew one thing for sure: the world would hear about this by morning. He could already imagine the headlines. But what mattered now was finding out who that mysterious man was, why he had the old clearance, and what was inside the broken memory drive. He didn't yet realize that the truth inside that drive would explain everything. The case, the running man, even the misunderstanding that had nearly caused a clash between allies. It was a clue that would change how both governments viewed what had just happened. As lightning flashed across the London sky, Drew whispered quietly to himself, "Please let this end without anyone getting hurt." But deep down, he knew it wasn't over. The night still held more secrets, and the line between duty and disaster was thinner than ever. The storm over London grew stronger that night. The rain hit the embassy windows like tiny stones, and the city lights blurred behind a curtain of water. Inside, everything was in motion, soldiers moving through hallways, officers giving quick orders, and embassy staff whispering nervously as they tried to understand what was really happening. Agent Mark Drew stood beside the royal commander near the main control table. A laptop was open, showing the half-broken memory drive found near the coat. An MI5 technician was carefully trying to open its contents. The small green light on the device blinked slowly as if teasing them with secrets. Drew's eyes were fixed on the screen. He had already replayed the entire day in his head a dozen times. The man running, the case, the guard, the misunderstanding, the armed units surrounding the embassy. And now this small memory drive was their only hope to find the truth. The technician finally spoke. "Got it open," she said quietly. Everyone leaned in closer. A folder appeared marked Internal Security Archive. Inside were several video clips and a few encrypted documents. The technician clicked one. The footage showed the same man, the one with the black case, walking through the embassy's lower hallway 2 days earlier. He was calm, carrying a staff badge, chatting with another worker. "That's him," Drew said immediately. "Same face. He was inside long before today." The footage continued. In the next clip, the man entered a small records room, looked around, and then unplugged one of the data terminals. He placed a drive inside his coat. The camera angle caught a glimpse of a second person in the reflection of the glass door, but the image was too blurry to identify. "Someone was helping him," Drew said. The commander's expression hardened. "Inside help," he murmured. The next few minutes were chaos again. The Royal Tactical Unit tightened their hold on the embassy perimeter. No one could leave or enter. The U.S. ambassador demanded direct communication with the palace. Drew could feel the pressure rising on both sides. The misunderstanding earlier was already bad enough. Now it looked like an actual infiltration had occurred under everyone's noses. Rainwater dripped from the edges of the soldiers' helmets as they guarded the entrances. The embassy courtyard looked like a battlefield of silence, no gunfire, but full of suspicion. Inside, Drew couldn't rest. He walked from one corridor to another, checking camera feeds, speaking with both British and American officers. He didn't trust anyone completely now. Suddenly, one of the guards stationed near the side stairwell called over the radio. "We found movement in the lower corridor. Someone's there." Drew ran without hesitation. The commander followed with 2 armed men. The narrow hallway was dimly lit, the air damp from old stone walls. When they turned the corner, they saw a shadow slipping through the maintenance door. Drew shouted, "And stop! Security!" The figure paused for half a second and then ran. Drew and the guards chased him down the staircase leading to the basement. The sound of boots echoed sharply. The man tried to open the exit door, but it was locked from the outside. He turned around, cornered. His hood fell back. It was the same face from the footage. "Don't move," Drew yelled, raising his hand. "We just want to talk." The man's breathing was heavy, his eyes darting around. He looked terrified. Not like a spy or terrorist, but like someone trapped in a mistake too big to fix. "I didn't mean to cause this," he said in a trembling voice. "They told me to take the files." "Who told you?" Drew asked gently. The man didn't answer. Before anyone could move closer, a loud metallic bang echoed from above. It sounded like another door slamming open somewhere near the courtyard. The radio burst with voices. "Multiple units at the entrance. Armed vehicles arriving." The commander looked alarmed. "That's not our team," he said quickly. Drew's instincts flared again. They all rushed back upstairs, leaving 2 guards with the suspect. When Drew reached the main hall, his eyes widened. More black vehicles had arrived outside the embassy gate. But these weren't police or palace units. Their markings were blank, their plates covered. Men in dark suits were stepping out, carrying cases that looked like communication boxes. British officers immediately aimed their rifles, blocking their way. The newcomers raised their hands but didn't step back. The tension was unbearable. It felt like another standoff was about to begin. The royal commander shouted through a megaphone, "Identify yourselves." One of the men outside spoke with a calm voice. "We're intelligence transport. We have clearance from cabinet command." But the commander shook his head. "That's not true. We received no such order." Inside the embassy, Drew realized something wasn't right. "They're here for the drive," he said quietly. "They must be the ones behind the leak." He turned to the MI5 technician and whispered, "Secure that memory device now." She nodded and slipped it into a small metal case used for evidence protection. Drew then walked to the main door, his wet boots leaving marks on the floor. He had been through enough confusion for one day. This time, he wouldn't let another misunderstanding spiral. He stepped out under the heavy rain, showing his badge high. "Agent Drew, FBI," he shouted. "If you have clearance, show it now." The man in the black suit pulled out a folded paper but kept it close to his chest. "We're authorized to collect embassy property connected to the investigation," he said. "That's not confirmed," Drew replied firmly. "You're on protected ground. No one removes anything until Palace Command verifies your presence." For a moment, no one spoke. Then the radio crackled with a new voice, the Palace Command Center. "All units, stand down. Those vehicles are not ours. Possible imposters. Hold position." That was all the commander needed. "Detain them," he ordered. The royal soldiers moved instantly, surrounding the black-suited men. Two tried to resist, but within seconds they were disarmed and pushed against their cars. Inside one of the cases, officers found another identical memory drive. The situation had now turned from political confusion to full criminal investigation. As the men were taken into custody, Drew looked back toward the embassy windows. He could see the lights of cameras still flashing outside the barricades, reporters shouting questions through the rain. But inside those walls, truth was slowly taking shape. Back in the control room, the technician had finally managed to open one of the encrypted documents. It contained lists, names, access codes, and schedules of embassy couriers. "Someone was building a pattern," she said. They were tracking which days the embassy files were moved. This was planned for weeks. Drew rubbed his tired eyes. Everything now made sense. The nervous man with the case, the fear in his face, the fake pickup attempt, even the sudden arrival of the imposters. He wasn't a terrorist at all. He was being used as a pawn in a larger scheme, a courier tricked into smuggling data. He turned to the royal commander. "He's not the enemy," Drew said quietly. "He's the key." The commander looked at him with a slow nod. "Then let's make sure he survives to tell the truth." Outside, the storm finally began to fade. The sound of the rain softened, replaced by the distant hum of helicopters leaving the area. For the first time all day, Drew took a deep breath. The misunderstanding between the FBI and the Royal Guard had almost started an international crisis. But now they stood together, two sides of duty facing a shared threat. Drew looked at the British soldier beside him, the same guard he had faced earlier with a drawn gun. The man gave a faint smile, a silent acknowledgement that respect had replaced suspicion. As Drew watched the detained men being led away into custody, he realized that the night had changed everything. What began as confusion between two officers had revealed something much deeper: trust built in crisis, loyalty tested under pressure, and the quiet understanding that sometimes even enemies of protocol could become brothers in purpose. But deep inside, he knew the story wasn't over. The captured men were only the surface of something far bigger. Somewhere out there, the real mastermind was watching, waiting to see how much the Americans and the British had discovered. The embassy lights stayed on through the night, shining like a small beacon through the London rain. And inside, Agent Drew silently prepared for what would come next. The part of the investigation that would finally expose the truth behind those dangerous 3 minutes that almost changed history. The night slowly faded into dawn, and a pale gray light spread across the city of London. The rain had stopped, leaving the streets glistening like polished glass. The embassy courtyard was quiet now, guarded but calm. The flashing lights were gone, the crowd had dispersed, and only a few tired officers remained at their posts. Agent Mark Drew hadn't slept. He stood by the large embassy window, watching the sky turn lighter. He had spent the last few hours writing his report, every detail still fresh in his mind. The royal soldiers were still stationed outside, but the tension had finally eased. Both governments had agreed to call the event an international security coordination effort. That phrase would hide the truth, the fear, the misunderstanding, and the narrow escape from disaster. The royal commander entered the room carrying 2 cups of coffee. "You look like you haven't blinked in hours," he said, handing one to Drew. "Couldn't," Drew replied quietly. "Too much to think about." They stood side by side for a moment, sipping in silence. The events of the last 24 hours had changed them both. They had started as strangers divided by duty, Almost enemies for a few seconds, but now there was mutual respect. Both men had seen how close they came to chaos, and how quickly control could vanish when fear and protocol collided. Downstairs, the captured men from the fake intelligence team were being interrogated by MI5. They had refused to speak during the night, but now one of them had finally started talking. The commander looked at Drew and said, "You might want to hear this." They walked into a small briefing room where a British officer played back the recorded conversation. The man's voice was calm but tired. "We were sent to recover embassy data," he said. "Not by the government, by private security contractors. They wanted those files because they contained information about ongoing joint investigations. They planned to leak them and blame it on American mismanagement." Drew frowned. So it wasn't espionage from another country. It was manipulation from the inside. "Exactly," the officer replied. "Someone wanted to make the U.S. team look reckless. That's why they targeted you. That's why the incident outside happened." Drew's mind went back to that single moment, standing in the rain, gun drawn, facing the Royal Guard. If that misunderstanding had turned violent, it would have given the people behind this plan exactly what they wanted: a scandal, a rift between allies. He leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. They almost succeeded. The commander nodded. Almost. Later that morning, Drew went to see the young man who had carried the black case. He was sitting quietly in a small interview room, hands folded, eyes red from exhaustion. When Drew entered, the man looked up nervously. "Am I in trouble?" he asked. Drew shook his head. "No, you're not. But I need you to tell me everything. Who gave you the drive? Who told you to drop it?" The man hesitated, then spoke softly. "It was someone I trusted. He said the files were just backups. He told me to deliver them to a courier near the park. I didn't know they were sensitive. When I saw guards and heard alarms, I panicked." His voice broke a little. "I thought they'd think I was dangerous." Drew nodded slowly. "You were caught in someone else's plan." The man looked down. "I didn't mean for anyone to get hurt." "No one did," Drew said gently. "And that's what matters." He left the room with a heavy heart. The young man wasn't a criminal, just a frightened worker used by clever manipulators. The truth behind the chaos wasn't evil in the simple sense. It was ambition, greed, and politics, people playing power games from behind desks, risking the peace between two nations for their own gain. Outside, the embassy courtyard looked peaceful again. The Royal Guard stood in his usual position, perfectly still, as if nothing had ever happened. Tourists began gathering again behind the barriers, taking photos of the soldiers in red coats. The city had returned to its rhythm, but for Drew, the world didn't feel normal yet. The memory of that moment, when two trained men had pointed weapons at each other under gray skies, still replayed in his head. He couldn't shake the thought that the world could break so easily over a misunderstanding. Later that afternoon, a joint press conference was held. Officials from both sides stood behind microphones, using calm words like communication error, cooperative investigation, and shared security success. Cameras flashed, reporters asked questions, and politicians smiled. But none of them could truly explain what had really happened in those tense minutes when fear ruled over reason. After the press conference, Drew met the royal commander one last time before heading back to his hotel. The commander extended his hand. "You did what you had to do," he said. "Instinct is not something we can train out of men like us. We just have to control it." Drew shook his hand firmly. "And sometimes control means trusting each other even when it's hard." The commander gave a small smile. "Maybe that's the lesson we both needed." That evening, as Drew packed his bag, he received a message from MI5. They had finished analyzing the memory drives. The files contained evidence of multiple attempts to sabotage intelligence cooperation between the two countries. The data had now been secured and turned over to both governments. The message ended with a simple note: "You were right to act fast." Drew closed his eyes for a moment, feeling relief for the first time in days. He wasn't proud of what happened, but he was grateful that it hadn't ended in tragedy. He thought about calling his family back home, but he decided to wait until morning. Right now, he just wanted to sit quietly and breathe. The next morning, as he prepared to leave for the airport, he passed through the same embassy gates where it all began. The Royal Guard was still there, standing tall and silent. Drew stopped for a second and gave a respectful nod. To his surprise, the guard's eyes shifted slightly, and with a barely visible motion he returned the nod. It was small, almost invisible to others, but to Drew it meant everything. It was the unspoken language of men who had faced danger and chosen restraint instead of violence. Walking toward his car, Drew felt lighter. The rain had gone, the sky was bright, and the city moved on as if nothing had happened. But he knew the lesson would stay with him forever. In those 3 minutes of fear and confusion, he had seen how thin the line was between peace and chaos. And he had learned that courage wasn't always about drawing a weapon. It was about knowing when to lower it. As his car pulled away, Drew looked back one last time at the embassy and the royal guard standing by. He thought about the strange way fate had tested them both and how close they had come to disaster. Yet through that near miss, 2 nations had rediscovered trust. Later, when the official report was published, it called the incident the 3-minute crisis. It became a case study in restraint and communication used by both British and American security agencies. But for Drew, it wasn't about fame or reports. It was about the moment he realized that even in the most dangerous misunderstandings, humanity could still shine through. That night, on his flight back to Washington, Drew looked out the window at the lights fading below. He whispered softly to himself, "No one fired. That's what matters." The engines hummed. The clouds drifted by, and for the first time in many nights, he finally closed his eyes, not as an agent on alert, but as a man who had witnessed the power of calm in the face of chaos. And far below, in the heart of London, the Royal Guard continued his silent watch under the same gray sky, unmoved, unwavering, and unaware that his brief standoff with an American agent had quietly reminded 2 great nations of the value of patience, understanding, and peace.